And it seems to me that one of the best tools that I could think of it's something that, our students say on campus a lot. I'm a professor here at the University of Michigan. I'm pleased to be able to work with undergraduates a lot. And one of the things that they always say to each other and to themselves is to monitor your airtime. It's such an interesting idea because it's about being aware of the kind of space that you're taking up. It's about being aware of privilege. It's about being aware of your own identity. So are you in one of those categories known for mansplaining, taking up a lot of space, having a lot of airtime in a way that keeps other people from fully participating and feeling comfortable in a setting where what you're trying to do is to be able to speak across differences, act collectively, to build a kind of collaborative, collective capacity inside of a group of people. And so I love this concept. And I thought what I wanted to do today is to talk a little bit more about, this idea of monitoring your airtime, which is what people are told in terms of having a real dialogue, and to think about one of the examples historically from some of my own work on the civil rights movement. So one of the civil rights leaders who I think best exemplifies this idea of monitoring your airtime and why that might be important. So I'm going to do a little bit of a quiz. If you figure out who this person is while I'm talking, you can kind of enter it into the chat or the Q&A. And so we'll kind of test people's knowledge of famous civil rights leaders. So this civil rights leader was the grandchild of slaves, graduated valedictorian from Raleigh, North Carolina, Shaw University in 1927, and then spent half a century raising the political consciousness of Americans across three of the major civil rights organizations throughout the 20th century: the NAACP, the SCLC, which is the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, and the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, or SNCC. Oh, Paula Murray, that was a good guess. No, that's not right. But that was a good effort. This person was an NAACP field secretary and later served as director of branches, and spent the 1940s traveling from small town to small town, convincing ordinary Black citizens who had been enslaved and terrorized for more than 200 years to join together peacefully and insist that they were deserving of basic human rights. No, it's not Ralph Abernathy, but another good guess. This person, after resigning from the national organization in 1946, NAACP, returned to Harlem because of a family situation, but stayed active in the New York chapter of the NAACP and was elected president of the New York chapter in 1952. There, this person built coalitions with other groups, worked on a campaign to end school segregation in New York, and even publicly confronted the mayor at one point. Oh, Adam Clayton Powell was good too. No, that's not who it is. So after the success of the Montgomery bus boycott and the Brown versus Board of Education decision, this person then went south to help organize some of the activity that was going on as more places wanted to implement tactics like the bus boycott in their own community. In 1958, this person moved to Atlanta to spearhead what became the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, the SCLC, which is a group that's going to primarily be associated with the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King. This person did not actually have a comfortable relationship with Dr. King. They clashed in terms of leadership styles. This person was a little impatient with the hierarchy of Black male clergymen and the kind of organization that they created. And right at the peak of frustration, this person was quite struck by what happened in 1960 when a group of college students refused to leave a Woolworth's lunch counter in Greensboro, North Carolina. This person wrote a letter on SCLC letterhead, which I always thought was a nice touch.
Somebody got it. Somebody got it.
So this person wrote on letterhead calling student leaders all across the South to join together to begin to work together. They had a days-long conference, and this created SNCC, the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, a youth-led group that helped to organize the 1961 Freedom Rides, directed many of the Black voter registration drives in the South, and drew national attention during the Mississippi Freedom Summer of 1964. This person was known for the ability to listen, to cultivate the talent of others, especially young people, to be participatory, to engage in consensus thinking, to question hierarchy, to monitor her airtime enough to let other people speak. And that person is Ella Baker, from whom I think we could learn a lot. Thank you.
I'm so sorry. I got so excited, Dr. Gillard, because Alicia Skillman, who is one of our wonderful star people in Detroit, wrote in on the questions, Ella Baker. And so I didn't mean to break in. I lost composure. I should probably monitor my airtime and turn right to Dr. Forsythe Brown for her remarks.
Okay, hi everyone. And it's wonderful to be back with you guys again. As I was thinking about the issue of competencies, which is one of my favorite little areas, how do we gain the knowledge that we need and be able to apply it to address these issues that we're facing today, particularly, issues on race and equity and inclusion. So I of course have more books, like I talked a lot about books the last time, and I'm going to start with the book that the University of Michigan Dearborn has selected for its common read coming in for this next semester. And it's How to Be an Anti-Racist, right here, okay? So it comes with there's a workbook that you can order it on Amazon if this is something you want to do. I really believe that for people who are just now coming into the dealing with these issues, if it's new to you that systemic racism is much deeper than you perceived it to be, a month ago, then there's a lot of kind of competencies that needs to happen for you. There's a lot of reading, a lot of development, and a lot of, what did you say, Bill? Manage yourself. So there's a lot of that needs to take place in order for us to be most effective, to have common language and understanding about the historic past and how systemic racism was created over this past 400 years and how it still applies, so that there's less arguing over terminology. There's less tension and division over who's responsible or how did we get here, and more of, okay, I understand, now what can I do? What can I personally do to be an agent of change and not continue to sustain an inequitable system? So with that, there, to me, also needs to be, for adaptive leadership, some spiritual leadership. We need to be conscious of what Jesus has taught us. And now I'm out of my depth. I'm not a theologian and I'm not a priest, but at the same time, I have found it when I'm teaching on workshops on race and equity and inclusion, I do find that being self-reflective is probably best, that people need to talk less and listen and respond internally a lot more. And kind of query, where are you contributing to the system? Where are you not hearing people of color as they're speaking their truths about their experiences? The last time we were together, I did bring up those central frames of colorblind racism. And one of those is that minimization of racism. Now, I mentioned also that it is one of the areas that has definitely been addressed with our current situation as we've kind of unveiled the fact that systemic racism is alive and well across the United States. But it also plays a role in when a person, or they're being treated, they perceive that they've been treated unfairly. What is your reaction? Is the reaction dismissive, or is it understanding? Is it tell me more about the situation? Or what I've gotten in the past is a very quick knee-jerk reaction. It's like, oh no, that can't be that way. That type of dismissiveness is not necessarily different from when women feel that they've been discriminated against by gender. You know it when you feel it. And having somebody dismiss it minimizes your experience, dismisses your experience, and does nothing to lead us to this path of breaking down issues of systemic racism. So a lot of self-management and kind of going back into biblical study, thinking more about being more empathetic, or then not just sympathetic, but empathetic. What are people actually going through? What are their experiences? What are their challenges? And also then breaking down some of the prejudices that we have. People have prejudices about all sorts of things. Bias is part of the human condition. How you address the bias is a different issue. If you are relying on that bias in your everyday interactions, this can be problematic. If you recognize that you have it and you're trying to deal with it and try to overcome it, that's a different story. We all have biases on something. So it's not like we can go from not having any bias to, or from having bias to not having any. We're all going to have some type of bias. This is a long-term process because of the way that we categorize information, that we shortcut experiences that we have and make links in areas that can lead to developing large grand generalizations about individuals and individual behaviors, particularly about individuals that are different from ourselves. So that is what I'm talking about when I mean bias. We just have to be conscious that we're doing it, and then even more conscious about how do we overcome it. The book on white fragility that I mentioned last time is a definite starting place for addressing some of the historical issues that we've had with systemic racism, as well as some of the issues of resistance as to why we haven't dealt with it up until this particular time. And I know I sound like a broken record, but I will continue to advise everybody, you need to read this book so that we can have better and more common understandings about where we are and what we need to address in order to make this emerging social movement a real movement that has substantive social change. The other thing I mention as well is that I mentioned this briefly last time I spoke as well about the differences in social movements. And what I'm really talking about is a two-pronged social movement. So it's a social movement that is large societal based, which is a reformative social movement. We need to break down the types of institutional racism that we have embedded in the social institutions up to this particular point. So that is a lot of policy, a lot of practices that have been done over many generations, such as redlining, or how people see loans to or evaluate individuals for loans. All of that kind of stuff, that is policy based, and it can be done at usually at the larger institutional or corporate levels. But an alternative social movement is an individual change movement. so that the individual needs to address some issues to overcome their biases and prejudices, to learn more about themselves and about others in order to be a better person, but it can also bring about change within society as well. And so both of these things need to happen simultaneously. And I perceive that they are happening simultaneously. But people can get overwhelmed with one or the other. And if I believe very strongly that if we don't try to do both simultaneously, we are going to miss this moment where we had an opportunity to really kind of deal with this albatross of race that had started since before we were a nation. And we will be back here in another 20, 30 years trying to address it at a later point. So.
Thank you so much. We will then turn to Bishop Wright, and just to pick up a little bit on what you say as a way of segueing, I really think the basic distinction you make between individual changes and change on an individual level, as well as policy, is extraordinarily important, because obviously when people do have these kinds of conversations, we immediately tend to go into policy discussions as if we're running the government, which is an interesting exercise in privilege, and helpful. But, you know, I find it's one of those privileges that everybody assumes. Everybody assumes, like, but for a turn of fate, they could be running the country. And in fact, the real difficult conversations need to be, and the real change perhaps happens when the individual sensibility is changed and shared by all. Bishop Wright, would you offer your perspective on the 4 practices and the 3 issues? Hope you're still muted. Sorry.
First, thanks to you, Bill, and to Dr. Ivy and Dr. Angela for kicking off. Look, Dr. King said that change does not roll in on the wheels of inevitability. Listen, it does not roll in on the wheels of inevitability, and we might say also does not roll in on the wheels of good intention or political correctness. So what we're talking about here is work. We've named this work adaptive leadership or adaptive work. So what is adaptive work? Well, adaptive work is the work of shifting values, norms, belief systems, and world views so that progress can be made on problems that, 1, don't have easy answers, or 2, that we'd rather avoid. This is critical. So this is the work. And so then we begin to, how do we approach this work? Well, the truth of the matter is that each of us have to sort of interrogate our own capacity or our own level of competency in this regard. And so what needs to happen is our individual capacity or competencies need to increase so that we can actually lean in and do some of this work. And so what we talk about competencies or capacities, we're talking about education, proximity, and purpose, right? I want to get to the questions in the group, so I won't go long on this, but I want to just name that: education, proximity, and purpose. And so this is why everybody's looking for books and resources right now, education, right? But the education is no substitute for proximity, and proximity won't be sustained without an abiding purpose. And so for us, for the people of goodwill, for the justice seekers, for the people who love freedom and want freedom extended broadly to neighborliness, for us, Paul helps us in his letter to the Ephesians, or Deutero Paul, if you please, helps us, and he reminds us that this is not a ground game, black against white or individual against individual. We are wrestling against powers and principalities, against evil in high, and I would say low places. And so what is necessary is to increase our capacity, competency for soul force. So it's not just enough to name fragility, defensiveness, and arrogance and bias. That's not enough. That's a description, and it can be very, very helpful as a beginning. What we need to name is also competencies we need to increase individually, black and white alike, so that we can actually get this adaptive work done. And they are, among others, compassion, curiosity, courage, and the ability to be comfortable in being uncomfortable. Right. And so this immediately plugs into what Bill is sketched out for us is that one of the competencies of adaptive leadership, of course, is self-management. Self-management. Dr. King talked about if you can't be nonviolent, don't get in it. He was making a self-management a point. We're talking about self-management. So the work that we know that will sustain a more perfect union, will help a more perfect union to be brought about, is not justice tourism, right? It's not justice tourism. Bless the Lord for all the tourists, but we need to be talking about people who want to embark on a sustained journey towards making this a more perfect union, toward the fulfillment of Jesus's ever enlarging, expanding neighborliness campaign. That's our work. That's what we want to do. And so that has everything to do with then individual increases in capacity for neighborliness, individual capacity for wrestling with evil, and an individual's capacity for circumventing contempt. Circumventing contempt, because contempt is parasitic. It siphons off the energy so that we don't get the work done. It's an interesting work avoidance strategy. If I can just be contempt, bring a lot of contempt to whoever occupies the White House, then that takes up energy, which is finite, we know, and reduces the energy that I actually have for neighborliness, proximity, and purpose. And so I would hold up some of those ideas again for you. Andy Young here in Atlanta talks about a capacity also as a competency is non-cooperation with evil. Non-cooperation with evil. I love the way that gets us into another conversation. Non-cooperation with evil. And then I would also say, lastly, a refresher, maybe a reminder of what I said another time. The word anger is not the same as the word rage. The word anger has its roots in the Norse word ang, A-N-G, which means that you can share another person's dignity violation so viscerally that you pitch in and you join that person alongside that person so that until some sort of rectitude, some sort of reconciliation, some remedy can be achieved. And so what we're really talking about here is, for all of our fancy words, we're talking about an increased depth and breadth of neighborliness. And so that's the invitation to white brothers and sisters and allies across the spectrum is that can you feel the pain of a Black mother losing a son in the way that you can feel the way a white mother feels when she loses a son? This is what Ella Baker invited us to think about. Until such time that happens, then we're not quite where I think the Bible would lead us, Jesus would lead us, and even the better parts of our founding documents would lead us. I'll stop there.
I want to ask a follow-up, because this is in many ways, when you named capacity building, it was the origin point for this second session. And one of the things that you've said elsewhere, Bishop, that I think is really interesting and important for us to lift up and keep in mind is you many times have defined racism as a failure in Christian discipleship.
Yeah.
And so when you think about capacity building and discipleship, can you speak a little bit more about that interaction between the two? What does it look like?
I can, and thank you, Bill. And I don't want to take up more time than I need to. I just want to say it, if you'll allow me to say it in a pithy fashion. We've been talking about all lives as an inadequate response to Black Lives Matter. And I do think it's inadequate. I think it's 401 years late. But my question is deeper, more penetrating. My question is, does Jesus matter? Right? Because if Jesus matters, then of course, then we're going to run to the one sheep that's in danger. We're going to run to the oxen or the child, as Jesus talked about, that's in the ditch. And so for me, whenever we're talking about racism and the sort of pernicious and persistent notion of white supremacy, what we're really talking about is this sin that clings so closely to this nation's vitals that keeps us from being the neighbor that Jesus is inviting us to be. And so we're having a failure in pulpits. We're having a failure in spiritual formation. We're having a failure in seminaries. We're having a failure one to the other Christian in terms of mutual accountability on what it means to be friends with Jesus. If we're friends with Jesus, we know that Jesus is for justice. And so this whole tennis match between black and white is really a facade and a distraction. The crux of the matter is, are we alongside Jesus? And if we're alongside Jesus, we will note Jesus's actions. And Jesus democratizes leadership. He says anybody can lead anytime, any place, anywhere. And if anybody can do that, then what we're supposed to be doing is figuring out a way to sort of revolt against everything that's not love. And part and parcel of everything that's not love is hatred, superiority, and separateness. And so for me, it's a profound failure of Christian witness. And the church is accountable.
Thank you so much. That was brilliant and wonderful. And I'm going to turn. We've got questions that are coming up, folks. We're going to turn to you fairly soon because we're doing it different this time. We're not going to take up too much airtime, even though we are all here to hear what everybody else has to say. So I'm going to turn quickly to Reverend Adams.
Yes. And what I find emerging from the respondents thus far is the tension between the work of the heart and the struggle to change our institutions. And both of those are critically important. It is our job. And when we start talking about how do we have a conversation amongst leaders and talk about adaptive leadership, here's the interesting thing. We're all leaders in that we all have a role to play. And it's going to differ depending on our location, right? But everybody must do something to bring us to a place where we are more like Christ as individuals, as families, as communities, as institutions, as states, as nations, as this world. And the work certainly must begin within the psyche and the inward attitudes that people have towards race and about race. We must work on the heart. And this is critically important. And in a lot of ways, we've made a lot of progress. But in a lot of ways, there's still a lot of change that needs to be made. The problem is that people become so invested in their opinions, they become so tied to their worldview that they find that a rejection of it is a rejection of themselves. Like we're finding in the state of Mississippi, where people are determined to wave the Confederate flag, even would have the Confederate flag within the state flag, even though the Confederacy was truly an anarchist movement, was against the government that we now know and recognize. The Confederacy hasn't existed for 155 years, but it's not a political issue as much as it's tied to the heart. You know, their granddaddy waved that flag, so on and so forth, because it makes absolutely no sense that these kinds of monuments to the past would still exist and certainly have life in present government. It doesn't have any life in the policy we pray in Mississippi, although Nina Simone said, Mississippi, bleep, bleep. You have to be in the Nina Simone, but that's a whole nother conversation. GD would be the first two letters of the words. But the point is that it's so tied to the heart. It's like a lady whose mom was making mom's making a ham. She said, Mom, you know, why do you cut the ends off your ham? Because my mother did. So the little girl went to her grandmother said, "Grandma, why do you cut the ends off of your hand?" And the grandmother said, "Well, I did it because my mother did it." So the little girl went to her great grandmother and said, "Great grandmama, why do you cut the ends off of your ham before you cook it?" She said, "Because our pan was so small that that's the only way we could fit it in there." And nobody ever stopped to question why they were still cutting off the ends of the ham when they had bigger pans now to cook. So we hold on to these views. A lot of times we're not even aware of why we do it, but it becomes so emotionally tied. But that's going to be hard work. That's going to be a protracted struggle. You know, if for Moses, it took him a lot longer to change the hearts of the children of God in the wilderness, 40 years, than it took for him to free the children of God out of bondage. For Elijah, he was able to feed the widow very, very quickly, and defeat the false prophets very quickly, but he never quite could change the heart of Ahab and Jezebel. That work takes a lot more time. And what I'm saying is, in this movement, there is a very unapologetic, impatient thrust towards social change that says, look, I don't care if you're ready to repent or not. I don't care if you're ready. You will atone, even if you're not ready to repent. There is an impatience here that I like, I must say. And it is something that's saying, look, we're going to change it whether you like it or not. We're going to change it, or we're going to deconstruct it. And I hate to say burn it down. I'm not celebrating that. I didn't throw any Molotov cocktails, but I also didn't create the system that has people so upset that they are ready to tear it all down. You know, when you talk about reconstruction, it's a purging, right? It doesn't get rid of everything, but it does question things, right? It questions where you get your advertising dollars. It questions where you invest and how you invest and who you invest in. It questions basic assumptions. And if you can't handle it, it's too bad. It's too bad, because the world is a changing, whether you accept it or not, or like it or not. And we must accept this crucible, this winnowing fork, this purification process. And the fact of the matter is, it's going to happen, a lot of it outside of our institutions. The Martin Luther King Jr. did most of his work outside of the conventions and the institutes. Some of the conventions, right? And the conventions split over the issue of helping him or not. And he was criticized within his church and on the outside of his church, within his denomination and on the outside of his denomination. He was criticized for taking a stand on the Vietnam War. He had to change outside the institution. I think about Dr. Dillard in her book when she was talking about Reverend Charles Hill and Father McDade and people like that. Most of their work, most of their effective work was done outside of the institutions that they served even. And when they did work within those institutions, they came under fire and criticism. And even in the preamble, Doc, when you were talking about Uncle Tom's Cabin, right? The pastor, what was the pastor's name in Uncle Tom's Cabin? I forget it, but it's the guy that in Uncle Tom's Cabin, there was a pastor who stood and protested against racism, and there was a deacon that wanted to throw him outside of the church. And what I'm saying is, and Reverend Hill and Reverend McDade and pastors like that kind of follow that archetype. But what I'm trying to say finally is that it's going to be a protracted struggle to change people's hearts. But it's time to bring greater accountability. And I'm not just talking about progress. Thank God for the progress that has been made. But now it's time for some more radical changes. And some institutions aren't going to make it. You know, the word says, behold, I do a new thing, right? So if God is doing a new thing, God is doing a new thing is a new thing, right? John said, and that was in Isaiah, John said, behold, I saw a new heaven and a new earth. Well, why does that have to be eschatological or apocalyptic, right? I think if you're saying that he saw a new earth, then that is historical. So that means that something has to change here. Something has to change radically. But I got good news for you. It's the preacher in me. I got to say it. I'm going to end it, Bishop Wright, with this. Since by man came death, by man also must come the resurrection of the dead. So what God was saying is, you have the power to make the changes. It's not if we reject your institutional stand, if we reject the institution itself, that's okay, because you are the institution. Institutions are created around your ideas. And you are not forgotten. You are not rejected. You are not unloved. If we say Black Lives Matter, we are in essence saying all lives matter. We're just saying you forgot one. Okay? So look, it's everybody is loved. Everybody is affirmed. And God bless you as we move on. And I took 5 extra minutes, but
That was worth it. I think.
I'm sorry.
No, the last webinar. The
I
last
had a
webinar.
clock here, didn't me?
No, it's okay. The last.
I might as well have just left it.
No, the last webinar, Bishop Wright came in high and hot, with his, he preached his sermon. So you got your chance. I feel like order has been restored in the universe now that you got to be able to say what you had to say, what God has given you to say. So I am grateful and blessed by what you said. I think particularly one of the things I want to do as a segue to Pastor Dostert is I think that the comments you made about Hill and many of the other leaders in Detroit being criticized within their congregation, I think there is a line to walk when you are a pastoral leader. When you get active outside the walls of your church, I think the normal concern that parishioners have is, can you still be their pastor if they don't disagree with you, if they don't agree with you? Can you still be their pastor when they need you? And that's the fear that gets awoken in the minds of parishioners often when a pastor feels called to speak about an issue or to be active beyond the walls of the church. And that's a real adaptive leadership issue for pastors, because in some ways you have to make sure that you're continuing to provide the kind of pastoral care that people need and to be the source of reconciliation within it. And one person who helps me to see that every day is Pastor Manisha Dostert, because just today I had an email that was pointed and direct and concerned, and said that I was getting too political. I let my clergy know, and Pastor Dostert said, "Oh, what an incredible opportunity for you to have a conversation with him." And I have to say, even though I had put in place all the good things you do, I wasn't yet seeing that conversation as an opportunity. So how do we continue as we lead to stay, to keep our hearts soft and our minds firm? Pastor.
Right. So I believe I speak for many when I would say that these are confusing times on how we should be. So, I mean, I think what I've heard from all the fantastic panelists is like managing self here is really, really, really crucial. And we're all being thrown so many things back and forth. And so I actually think that our panelists probably have a lot of wisdom, as does Pastor Christian and Father Bill. What I was realizing was that there is a book in the Bible called the Book of Esther. And Esther was a woman who was just like a normal soul. She saw what was going around. There were politics that were big and beyond her. And because of a series of really unfortunate events, she ended up being in the midst of a place where she had power, where she didn't even expect to have power, nor want it, actually. And she didn't know what to do. There was a part of her that just wanted to run away and avoid it, and even to the extreme. And some wise soul said to her, "It's for this time that you may have been called." And I actually think that's the answer for every single one of us. I mean, none of us chose to be in this time. None of us expected it. Even those who wanted it wouldn't have known that it would come about this way. And it was as if God said to each one of us, "It's for this time that I made you."
Yes.
And so I just feel
Hallelujah.
like that, with that kind of purpose, and Bishop Wright talked about the importance of purpose. With that kind of purpose, my goodness, I feel like I can accomplish so much more than I could before that. So it's the reason that I believe that Father Bill will be able to speak to people who disagree with him with immense love. He was called for this time. I have witnessed Father Chris speak to those who do not agree with gay priests and speak to them with immense love. I think that kind of way of being is the way of Jesus and the way of the church. It's something unique that we have to offer the kingdom. And I just look forward to sort of figuring out what that looks like as we move forward.
Thank you so much, Pastor. Father Chris.
Well, you talked about, you lifted up purpose just now, and so maybe I'll lift up proximity to Bishop Wright's three-part education, proximity, and purpose. As I was thinking of my own life and those moments where I saw transformation around prejudice and bias, I think back to our legendary wedding that happened right after the change of the law. There was 700 people or 800. We never really got a full count of who showed up, but it was a party. The whole city showed up. Friends of mine from college, my fraternity buddies, they showed up. Everybody in the world showed up, but my stepmom. And she was somebody who wasn't just a stepmom. She had raised me from being a kid. She knew every hair on my head. And it really hurt me. And in fact, it actually made me angry. It felt like such a violation of expectations and relationship. And of course, what was going on there is that she was a Mormon. And okay, she was Mormon, I get it. But I really felt that our relationship should have somehow broken through that. And I came to realize after listening to her more, there was no amount of education. We had debates ad nauseum about scripture. We had debates about all kinds of things. No amount of education was going to change her mind. But what changed eventually was me, because I listened to her long enough to find out that, to the story that you were telling, Christian, it wasn't her doctrine, religious doctrine, that held her back so much. It was her loyalty to her father's memory, who had passed her the religion that she was the last holder of in her family. And so this was as much about her holding on to her father's faith as much as anything. And when I came to understand that, my anger subsided and I was able to sort of take her perspective, even though I didn't agree with it. And then that allowed me to let my guard down and just focus on proximity. We kept inviting her. Come to the girls' birthday party. Come to my ordination. Come to their baptism. We just kept inviting her. We kept sending her flowers on Mother's Day like we normally would, all that stuff. And over time, she started to say yes. And as she said yes, and the relationship grew, and she started to see our kids as her grandkids in a way, it changed. She changed. I changed. We changed. All the anger, the resentment that we had, the hurt feelings subsided. And nobody ever planned it. We didn't have a 4-point plan. We didn't think this was going to work out necessarily, but we just thought we just keep doing what's right. We're going to stay in proximity and see what the Spirit did with it. And sure enough. And so I just want to lift up, yeah, amen. Education and purpose, but proximity is powerful. Being in relationship and letting the relationship, see if the relationship might provide the purpose that's missing. Let's see if the relationship might provide the holes that your education doesn't have, and give you the incentive to just find a way forward despite it all. And I think this work of reconciliation that we're called to do, which we're talking about here, it really for me begins with proximity, with relationship, with putting down our old nets, taking up the new ones, and seeing where it leads us. And I sometimes think we sometimes get caught up in wanting to start with education. We want to start with reading books. We want to go to the book clubs. We want to get the diversity training, and all that stuff's great. I've done it too. It's fantastic. But what scares me about this project of becoming an anti-racist is the difficulty around proximity. For many of our churches, we are a white church in upper crust suburban neighborhoods. And there's a proximity issue, and we've got to start thinking of ourselves as missionaries or something to just get out of our space, so we can kind of be in relationship with folks that we're trying to understand.
That's a really beautiful insight, Chris, and thank you for that incredible, powerful story of transformation. And I think that just to sharpen things, and we're going to get around to your questions, folks. But I want to give the panelists one chance to kind of circle around and to say that, just pick up on what you were saying, what Pastor you were saying, and Christian as well. The elements of personal transformation and proximity, but then to talk about the issues around education and purpose and being in things together requires some kind of institutional change or framework that is necessary. I mean, in some ways, the personal transformation that you had with your stepmom would have been impossible without the wider change in institutions that allowed you to have that marriage, obviously. And then, of course, the challenges that we have to finding out what is going to be of this transformation, what is going to be ours. I was talking to somebody who unexpectedly found her career made her a celebrity, and her discernment when she accepts a speaking engagement, she said, as I pray, and I said, what is mine in this? What is something that I need to do? And some of the questions I'm trying to drill down today is, with all of you who are part of churches, what is it the church's business to do right now that no one else can do in this work? And I don't have an order. I'm just going to trust that someone's going to say something.
Well, I don't know if I can address that, Bill, so I'm very sorry that I want to talk first. But I did want to say, there was a couple things I did want to say. And Chris, thank you so much for your story. That's wonderful. And to keep us mindful that relationship is key and proximity is key to overcoming some of the differences that we have between individuals. But I also want to say that to your comment toward the end there, Chris, that for a lot of our congregations, the parishes are predominantly white. So we're dealing with, as the church, a predominantly white institution. However, not all of the places where our parishioners engage in their everyday lives is an all-white entity. Quite frequently, they're going to jobs where there's quite diverse in a variety of different ways. But the question is, are people making bridges? Are they, what's another phrase? Are they blooming where they're planted? Are they making relationships with others in those spaces? So it may be that it's not so much what's happening in the parishes. That may be a different type of work that needs to be done. But the type of individual work that I was advocating for can be done in these other places where we engage with people who are different from us on a regular basis. Whether that is engaging differently with the secretary at work, or asking a colleague that you've never asked before to join you for lunch, or inviting him to the golf game that's happening on Friday after work. I mean, there's a myriad of different opportunities that we have a tendency to gravitate to those people we assume are going to be like us. And we make efforts to befriend those individuals. And I'm suggesting we may find that we have more in common with other people who we're perceiving to be very different, who may not actually be. Particularly since in many cases, our work environments are already classed. So you're crossing different levels of social status. It's just you're crossing race. So if you're an attorney and you know that there's a Black attorney or a Latino attorney or whoever in your office, what is your relationship with that attorney? Now we're on an equal status position, which is a concept for breaking down prejudice, or in many ways, it's called the equal status contact hypothesis, that we need to be with people of similar status positions to us. As long as there's a hierarchy where you're the boss to Latino workers, or you're the boss to African-American workers, that power differential makes it problematic for you to have the type of relationship, to see that group as similar to yourself. So we now need to go, who is similar to you, of similar socioeconomic positioning, but who is racially different or ethnically different, and make some bridges there, I guess is what I'm trying to say. The other thing I wanted to mention is something I've mentioned to pastors quite frequently in casual conversation. I'm sure I may have had this with you, Bill, at one point. Because I'm very, and I would like the other priest here to chime in and respond, please. I'm very upset with the response of many people when we're starting to do this type of work or having these issues around race, that they become very fearful. And it's like they wrap themselves in fear. They think that this is chaos or whatever type of social disorganization, and that's going to lead to, mass movement marches down Woodward Avenue into their neighborhoods and communities and storm their houses. Okay, it's unfounded fear. But even if it was a founded fear, hypothetically, if I'm not mistaken, Jesus says multiple times throughout the New Testament, do not be afraid. And all sorts of angels and whatever come to different people throughout the Bible and say, do not fear, do not be afraid. If we are people of faith, then why is everybody so scared? That's my question. You cannot have real, true, deep, honest faith and be that petrified that somebody's going to come and attack you and your way of life is going to disappear overnight. That's, to me, a real barrier, because people will hold on to their preconceived previous positions in order to comfort themselves to protect themselves from this fear. They're not going to want change. They don't want something new. They like the status quo because it's comfortable and they understand it. So those are I want to talk about fear, please, Bishop. want to toss it to you, Rob, but
I think you said it eloquently. My hope is that we could get to some of the questions. I'm seeing some good stuff popping up now.
Yeah, and let me just pull from Alicia Skillman, who has asked a really important question, and I think she's named something that's been going on in this conversation, which is, I think we are, each of us comes from a slightly different church background, and very different church backgrounds actually, and so it's just saying that what the church can do is to speak kind of in a decontextualized way, and so what she raises, she said, is what comes up for me, right or wrong. And Alicia Skillman, by the way, I just say it again, came up with Ella Baker. Alicia, she says, what is right? What comes up for me, right or wrong, is what is the white church can do that no one else can do? What is the black church can do that no one else can do? There is a lot of work to do for churches, and so she wants to maybe focus us and ask us to answer the question from our different perspectives, maybe our different churches, or maybe together, which is what Pastor Dostert suggested. What can we do together that will be unique?
So let me take a swing at that. I appreciate that question, and I'm so glad you got Ella Baker. She's a particular favorite of mine. What we see in most pastoral relationships, and I think Bill and Christian are a wonderful example of the contrary. We see an abiding depth and affection between these two, and they're doing some work together, which is moving the needle, which is consequential. I think we don't see this as often as we need to see this. I think that black pastors and white pastors are in congregations not very far from one another and only have a very thin veneer of relationship between them for lots of reasons, and I get it and I understand. But I think that's the key. I think that the key is, without agenda and without competition, could we get together and figure out perhaps what is the work, and then we can figure out our unique gifts to that work. But if the work is trying to harness and mobilize as many Christians as we can in a particular geographical area, so that we can bring some sort of effect to the power structure and change it, make progress on things that are important, then I think it has to start with relationship. We don't have that. Pre-COVID, the vast majority of pastoral relationships, one to the other, were very superficial. And that's within the denomination and certainly beyond the denomination. We don't know each other very well. And the truth of the matter is that we don't prioritize it because there's no significant tangible gain to it. And so I think that maybe COVID is inviting us to think differently now about our priority structure. And so, maybe when the world pivots in a different direction, or maybe even now because of Zoom, maybe we can begin to do some of that. But I think it has to be across race, it has to be across town, and it has to be to at least begin to investigate what might we do together. I think until we do that, we won't ever find out what your gift is, what my gift is, and how we can pull those two together or other gifts together and get something actually done. And of course, I want to also flag, not everybody who's the head of a congregation or denomination or anything thinks that the work is to actually get something done. A vast majority of us have adopted a shopkeeping as church, a set of practices. And so not all of us share the viewpoint that there's more on the table for us as a church than simply to belong. It is also to become and to invite the culture to become. And so we have to find some like-minded folks. We have to find, and so again, this is where purpose has to be our North Star. If we can establish this as purpose, then we can begin to sort of sift through relationships and find people willing to get some stuff done. But until then we'll all sort of be in separate silos and not achieving very much except for competition for members.
That's beautifully put. Can I open it up to the other panelists to speak to that?
I've been thinking a lot in this conversation about Ella Baker and about, the moment of the civil rights movement that she was involved in. And I mean, I've been writing a lot lately about the civil rights movement. So I've been, it's been kind of in my head lately. And that's kind of an example that I think is a shared example that we can pull from in some ways. And I think, that the one thing to kind of think about, so this question of what can the white church do? What can the Black church do? I don't think it's a bad way of posing the question. I think that there were moments during the civil rights movement. Freedom Summer, I think, is a really interesting example where so many white Christians moved by faith, moved by God, moved by purpose, go south, out of a real desire to be in struggle, in solidarity with Black communities, to right the wrongs. They're young, so they wanted it to happen right away, right? I mean, people in the 60s would think about like in 5 years, right? We're going to have solved this problem of racism. And a number of things happen that are very good. And then a number of things happen that are very bad, right? So some people come with their privilege and use it in really good and productive ways. A lot of people come with their privilege and don't use it in good and productive ways. They don't come with a kind of generosity. They don't come monitoring their airtime. They don't come to help to build the capacity of poor Southern Blacks, right, who want to be in they just take over. And in doing that, wreck what could have been a much more longer term productive series of movements and initiatives growing out of the South. And it falls apart because I think people can't figure out how they use their privilege. And this is true not only in terms of race, right? So white people, young white people, college educated, all of this talent, all this capacity, just taking up too much space. It also happened in terms of gender. So women really struggle to be able to be taken seriously, to be allowed to participate as equals and leaders. Even African Americans who were college educated going to the South experienced problems. And so I think that this is a moment, if we think about not what we can do despite our privilege, but what can we do with our privilege, and how do we use that in the right sorts of ways, where we're encountering each other with generosity, helping to build other people's capacity, so that it's there, because you can't deny it, right? If you've got a white racial privilege, if you've got a male privilege, if you've got a heterosexual privilege, whatever it is, right? We all come with these things. And so it's not that we somehow ignore them, right? Or pretend that they're not there. But I think part of the trick might be thinking about how to use it productively. I'll do one just quick example that comes from watching young people and how they've been operating in these activist circles. And one of the things that they've been doing, if you're white, in some cases, if you're male, if you're able-bodied, that they will physically make a chain around more vulnerable people in certain situations, if they're facing police or if they're, and so it's this idea where they're thinking in really concrete ways, what does it mean to come to a struggle with a group of people, and think about how you use your privilege, whatever that privilege might be, situated in these ways in which you're trying to protect others, where you're being generous, and that you're trying to build the capacity of everyone. So it's kind of some of the things that I've been thinking about across this conversation, and then looking at some of the comments and questions, which I think people are really raising some important things there about white churches and Black churches, and then time and scale, right? So how long is it going to take, right? I mean, those sorts of things.
Yeah, and that's the pickup on another question that's been asked. But when we had Charles Blow on our webinar here a few weeks ago, before any of the season of protest began, and he emphasized that it was going to take a long time. But I think that, I guess I would like to hear from the panelists, do you think that some of the incrementalism that we've been experiencing, or that he in some ways was advocating for, has been disrupted by this kind of changing sensibility that's emerging among younger people in the protests?
I would say yes, that incrementalism has been interrupted, given this current moment. That just for instance, the whole situation with the Confederate battle flag on the Mississippi state flag, that happened almost overnight in a very seamless way, regardless of the fact that they had a referendum on the same issue 20 years ago that was decidedly turned down by the citizens of the state of Mississippi. But now they didn't put it on a referendum. That was not even an option. It's like, okay, we're going to handle this right now, right here, right now. We're going to take care of this. So, well, why is that? Why were, I find it's a different legislature than it was 20 years previously, but still, they could have easily gone back into, okay, this is something that we need to reconsider, and maybe we should have another referendum and go in this kind of incremental approach. And that just didn't happen this time. I believe that the scale of the protest and the sustained nature of these protests has really, really interrupted this very calm, let's go through the policy, let's do it in a procedural type way that we have been doing dealing with race in the previous decades, I guess, or even generations. That this is now hitting at a different level where corporations are making statements. So when corporations are starting to make statements, these are hardcore dollars that states know they're not going to get if they don't make the changes in some type of meaningful, timely way. Similarly, with the taking down some of these statues of Confederate generals and other slaveholders and what we've had in the past, I believe it's also the same. Now, okay, the protesters have taken down quite a few on their own, but you also are seeing municipalities that are being a little bit more proactive. So instead of waiting for the protesters to show up to destroy the monument, let's just take it down and put it, in storage on our own, and we'll figure out what we're going to do with it later. Now, this is coming within a very short period of time of 3 years ago, where there was calls for taking down some of these monuments, and people were like, oh no, we can't do that. We have to figure out what we're going to do. That's all gone. People are just moving to action very rapidly. Again, I think it's dollars, but I also think it is the scale that we have. Now, one of the things for sociology is we deal a lot with social change, we deal a lot with culture and cultural change. And our common phrase, mantra, if you would like to call it that, is that change is slow. Cultural change is slow. If you think it's slow and you think it's 20 years is slow, no, we're talking glacially slow. It takes a long time for cultures to change. We've been 40, 50, 60 years now since the civil rights movement. We're still dealing with issues. It is illegal to discriminate against people, yet it is still happening, which is why we're in this current moment now. The cultural portion of this, the hearts and the minds, takes a much longer period to make change. And so people need to understand that this is not going to happen overnight, that the system of white privilege that has been constructed over 400 years is not going to be dismantled overnight. And even if the policy, procedures, and practices that are part of the institutions are addressed and dismantled, the hearts and minds of individuals who still occupy some of those positions is going to take much longer to deal with.
Bill, may I add?
I was
Please
just
go ahead.
I think what's so interesting, just kind of, riffing on that a bit, is that to have watched over the last 10 years or so, these calls around police abolition, defunding the police, move from the fringes, closer to a sort of center of discourse. And I think, the one of the things that's really distinctive about this moment is that the incrementalism just isn't sufficient, right? That people are really feeling that's not going to cut it, and that we need to put some of these big structural issues on the table, and really start to think about how are we allocating resources, right? I mean, why is it that, the police should get 10 times the funding than our schools, right? 7 times the funding than our healthcare, 5 times the funding than mental health services. And so when you get beyond the kind of shocking, what do you mean defund the police, and start to really look at what it is that people are talking about and trying to put on the table in this moment, that really is about changing these structures that have become so normalized that we can't think about alternative possibilities. I mean, so I always tell people who ask me, well, what would it look like not to have the police? I say it's like my neighborhood in Ann Arbor. I mean, it's a really nice, lovely green neighborhood where the police don't feel like an occupying army to us, right? Who live in this situation. And so I think it's one of those that you need to get beyond these things that seem so shocking to really these kinds of substantive conversations about structures and about fairness, and not just fighting over, a really shrinking, diminishing pie, but making a bigger pie, right? I mean, really thinking about these sorts of possibilities. I mean, I think it's a really extraordinary moment. And even though it's a tough moment, it's a sad moment, it's been so difficult. I feel fortunate that I've seen it, where there is actually this sense that maybe if enough of us push and shove in the same direction, that we really can start to change some of these deep structural systemic problems.
May I just say, Bill, and then we're wrapping up, and so this is probably too late, but when we're talking about investigating systems like white supremacy and structures, I love Dr. Dilley's word, structures. Here's a part that doesn't get talked about very much. Systems are propped up by all kinds of cooperation and collusion in very sophisticated and complex ways. And so one part of this conversation that I'm very interested in is what is the role of Black Americans in particular, and Black people in America? What's their role in propping up white supremacy? This is a conversation that will get you in trouble in a lot of places. Christian can't preach this in his congregation on Sunday, let me tell you. But I'll tell you, I think it has to be investigated. Let me tell you, this is how we know that white supremacy is in the air. I was just on a run with my son. He's 17 years old. The muscles are coming. The height is coming. He's becoming aware of his physicality. Beautiful young guy, but he's a cream puff, right? But a beautiful guy. We're jogging along, and he's faster than I am, so he goes ahead. And he's starting to realize, he's running with his shirt off, he's starting to realize the gaze that he's getting from our white neighbors down by the river. And without any coaching, without reading any books, without any sort of mentoring, he decides that he's got to spend a lot of time smiling as he's running to begin to mitigate the suspicion and the fear he's perceiving. And he came and he talked to me about that. And I said, where did you learn how to do that? And so I'm just using that as one, perhaps a clumsy example of the people who have been under the knee of the Derek Chauvins for 401 years. We have figured out a way as a means to survival to contribute to white fragility. And so, part of the work that has to be done is not only with our white brothers and sisters, they have their work to do without a doubt. But that does not mean that our response on this side of the equation is to sit passively, wait and watch for them to get their work done. What our work has got to be interrogated. And so, we've got to interrogate how we are cooperating with these systems. Why is it that we don't value ourselves enough, that we haven't raised holy hell over at least the length of my life, 56 years, when we have this reoccurring sort of thing? Why does that not get sustained, right? Why does it have to be about when white people are ready to receive now the dignity of Floyd or Breonna or et cetera, and then begin to make amends or changes? So I want to throw that out there. If we're going to do serious investigation of what ails us, we're going to have to look at that side of it too. It's not only the white brothers and sisters' work. They have their work, to be sure. Not trying to round off those edges at all. But if we're talking system and if we're talking structure, then we're talking about something we have built together, consciously or unconsciously.
I think that is so profound. And, one of my favorite African-American artists is Mark Dukes, who's an iconographer. And a whole line of his paintings circle around the smile. And so he does African-American subjects, but he actually does a reverse. I hope I can explain this adequately. A reverse blackface in which the smile is a white smile. And his argument is that the smile exists to allay white anxieties, and is one of the survival techniques that have been done. And so that you actually cannot see African Americans because of the smile. The smile is both the mask to pick up on a cultural milieu, and it's the negotiation of white anxieties. And it makes his work, for me, the most challenging and remarkable work. So, I think the artists have been ahead of us in many ways in some of this interrogation. And I think also what has often happened in conversations like ours is that kind of conversation that you brought up, Bishop, would be seen as an internal conversation among African Americans and would be kept out of white circles. And I understand that, number one. But number two, I think actually speaking about those survival techniques helps white people understand the depth of what is going on. And so my hope as the church goes forward, our church is, and the body of Christ together is, I think, actually having that kind of courageous conversation around people. Nothing so much internalized. Help me understand, for example, that negotiation as Mark Dukes's artwork, or just hearing you speak about that, because that brings it home in a way nothing else does. Because of course I'm a father too, and go ahead, Pastor. You want to jump in? I see.
Yeah, I'm curious. As a person who is neither white nor black and has watched for my years on this earth, what it has been like to be a white person and what it's been like to be a black, and wondered about it. I had always wondered and found some hope in a vision of how whites and blacks may begin to sort of interact with one another in reimagining the way that their relationships are. Because what's so difficult is because of all the structures and the history and the power and the prestige and the privilege and the pain, there is a kind of unifying vision of the way things are, victim versus oppressor, power versus powerless. And what I always found with Jesus is he sort of rejected the idea that the powerless were actually powerless, that in fact it was the powerless that had the power. And my favorite parable that shows that is the parable of the Prodigal Son, in which the one who took the money, who had everything, had been given the best, squandered that relationship, absolutely could not figure out what the goodness in that relationship was, and had to go through the dirt and the mud to finally realize this can't be the best possible way to live. There's got to be a better way. And I think it has something to do with going back to where I was with that person who I didn't want to be with anymore and I thought was worth nothing. And the son goes back to the father. And the father has so many options on how to be. And the father embraces, because there's no other option except love for the one who was so deeply wrong. And it makes me wonder if that's not something that the Christian vision can offer, that the one who squandered a relationship that was so powerful and that they had the privilege to have is the white population in the United States. And the one who has the ability to embrace and welcome back is the Black population. And they wait, and they hope, and they know that the way to return is the way to embrace. I don't know if that works, but it's just one thing that I've been thinking about for a long time.
I think we're going to stop there. We have finished this, our time. I don't know if we've finished the conversation. I think we've just gotten started. I want to thank you all for participating tonight. And I think that was a lovely reflection, Pastor, to finish with. And I want to thank profoundly our panelists for this second part of this incredibly important conversation. And we are going to continue to have these conversations as we go forward. And I've taken up walking since COVID-19 has come, and so I walk 6 or 8 miles a day, and so that means I'm listening to a lot of Brene Brown. And one of the things she and others, I just want to say Bishop Wright has an amazing podcast. Be encouraged, and 4 people, you should go check it out. But Brene Brown at the end of her webinar says, "Be awkward, kind, and brave." And every time she says that, I feel to myself like I've got the awkward part down. I mean, I have nailed that. I mean, no one does that better, in my opinion.
You got the other 2 down too, man.
Oh, you're the kindest. So
don't shortchange yourself here.
But I guess what I would want to say is to the people out there tonight who have been with us and have blessed us with their ears and their hearts and their minds and their questions, my hope is that you'll continue to walk with us as we try to make our way home to our Father who loves us so. And I think I'm going to ask actually Father Chris to close us with prayer.
Loving God, we give thanks for, again, this time together. We give thanks for the stories and for the hearts that we have heard. We give thanks for the ears that you have helped us to open tonight so that we might hear one another. We would ask that you would bless us with open eyes so that we might go forth into the world in the days and the weeks and the months to come, so we might see the world as you see it, as a world of one people, and that we might be able to live into that vision, working together. Amen.
Amen. Thank you all for being with us tonight. We really appreciate you being with us. Stay tuned for other webinars that will be coming your way, and we might have a surprise guest or 2 coming. God bless you all. And everybody else, we'll see you.